It's Dr. Wayne Mapp, the Honourable Dr. Wayne Mapp.
Mr. Speaker, thank you for the opportunity to take a call on this. And of course the reason I am taking a call is in my role as Minister of Research, Science and Technology. In due course that would obviously change to Minister of Science and Innovation. And I want to obviously spend the bulk of my speech on those points. But can I say to the previous speaker, who raised all sorts of straw man arguments, he needs to remember that when we became the government, we inherited a national library in huge physical disrepair. That party over there spent 9 years in government, 9 years in surpluses, and did nothing. They passed on, along with the rest of the problems in the government sector, a national library in physical disrepair. And so if members of the public who wonder why they're not able to access the library at the moment is because tens and tens of millions of dollars are being spent to refurbish that facility, which will lead to a greatly improved facility. 52 million, in fact, as informed by the Minister of Internal Affairs. That is the reason, Mr. Speaker, why in the past the Treaty of Waitangi had been damaged, because it had not been properly cared for. A new, properly refurbished library should have been done years ago. We're doing it now. Will ensure that that sort of disgrace will never occur again. So I can only say about the previous member that it was simply mock outrage on his part. Mr. Speaker, I want to get on to the rather more important and, for me, the material part of the bill. The bill is significant in that it merges the Ministry of Research, Science and Technology and the Foundation into a single new ministry to be called the Ministry of Science and Innovation. And that, amongst other reasons, is one of the reasons why this is truncated. Mr. Shearer talked about the problems of transition. And there is no doubt during a period of transition, staff are concerned. They are worried about their future and so forth. It is extremely important when you're going through a transition of this nature to do it quickly. It's one of the lessons, in fact, that Sir Roger Douglas puts out as one of the key principles of reform. Do it quickly because you actually minimise disruption and enable people to get on with things and look to the future. So that is one of the reasons why there is this shortened period, because when it's about fundamentally the internal processes of government, it is appropriate in that case to have a somewhat shorter process than might otherwise be the case. Mr. Speaker, the merger of the two organisations is part of the fundamental reforms that are occurring in the research, science and technology sector. There's really 4 parts to it. The first was to get a clearer set of priorities. The previous government simply had not done that in their 9 years of office. And I inherited a sector that, frankly, was disillusioned and dispirited. Certainly there had been some things that had been done in the previous 9 years, but they'd seen an ad hocery that had been occurring over a number of years and no real sense of direction or sense of priorities. So it was the very first thing that needed to be sorted out, getting a strategic sense. So last year we essentially set out a document which made the priorities of the government much more transparent and made it apparent to the sector where the government saw what the government saw as the key priorities. They are, in fact, at the centre of this government's reform process, improving the performance of the economy. The reason being, in the previous 5 years, export performance in this nation had been fundamentally flat. There'd been a huge growth of credit, and we are reaping the consequences of that today. So when the government talks about years of economic mismanagement by the previous government, we are focusing on quite specific things. The fact that under the previous government economic performance had been flat for 5 years, the fact that there had been a substantial growth in the public sector, which was essentially squeezing investment out of the private sector and leading to an excessive growth of credit. We are having to deal with the consequences of that today. So we've had to put that right, and this reform is part of that package. Science and innovation forms one of the 6 key drivers of this government's agenda. The second stage of the science and innovation reforms was the CRA task force, well accepted around this House, and I do acknowledge Mr Shearer's acceptance of the importance of that work. That's been implemented now. The third phase of the reforms was primarily the 2010 budget, which actually followed on the increase in fundamental science funding in the 2009 budget. The 2 budgets in this area have to be seen as a package. 2009, fundamental science; 2010, more focused on business, seen as a package, and a significant increase in the circumstances that we face in the overall science expenditure. Nearly $100 million, in fact, in the space of 18 months across the 2 budgets. That is quite significant when you consider that the government has a deficit in the region of $9 billion, nearly 4% of GDP. And so to increase funding in those circumstances is a significant challenge. And I'm surprised that the opposition isn't willing to acknowledge the challenge of increasing expenditure in a particular sector in the face of such substantial deficits. One needs to remind them from time to time that they had 9 years of surpluses. Some of them were produced by increased taxes, but some of them were produced by overall increased economic activity during their 9 years. Much more difficult to do these things in the circumstances of the current government. And the previous government needs to actually recognise what we've had to inherit compared to what they inherited from us in 1999. Mr Speaker, the fourth component of the reforms is the ones we are dealing with today, the merger of the institutions and indeed the renaming of it. And I want to emphasise that particular point. Research, science and technology as a package, those 3 words, tend to convey an impression this is primarily about the public sector as opposed to the private sector. Science and innovation has 2 elements to it. Firstly, it simplifies the title, that's self-evident, but it also indicates a sense of direction, much more of a package. So you have science, more public sector related, and you have innovation, more private sector related. It is intended to indicate to within the sector and more broadly outside of the sector the direction of travel of this new ministry. And so whilst there will be some savings in the establishment of the ministry, that's not the prime reason for doing this reform. The prime reason is to have a more effective ministry that will drive ahead this element of the government's agenda, really actually start to get a framework in place that will enable greater effectiveness around the expenditure that New Zealand taxpayers make. I do understand that there are people saying that there should be a greater expenditure. I do understand that a number of other nations that we might compare ourselves do spend more than we do, although it's fair to note that they have a larger industrial component to their economy than we do, and that does explain some of the difference. Mr Speaker, in closing, can I say this? The package of reforms that I've described is intended to lead to a cultural as well as an economic change. It's intended to essentially say to the sector and the private businesses that interact with them that this represents an opportunity, that the government is backing you And we are looking at ways, both in Budget 2010 as that is rolled out, but also for the future, to see what we can do that is better in a time of economic strictures. And we will be focusing diligently over the next period of time to enhance the sector. Mr. Speaker,